Hey guys, tonight we begin with a figure draped in laughter, wrapped in riddles and shadowed by danger. The medieval jester. Not the goofy court clown you've seen in cartoons, but the sharp-tongued, quick-witted performer who danced on the edge of disaster. They weren't just entertainers, they were emotional regulators, political chess pieces and masters of survival in one of the most unforgiving chapters of human history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When we think of medieval jesters, our minds often conjure cartoonish images. Floppy hats with bells, slapstick gags, and endless pie-in-the-face humour. But what if I told you the truth was far darker and far more interesting? In the real Middle Ages, jesters were not fools, but finely tuned instruments of emotional management, political commentary, and survival strategy. Far from being the lowest rung of court life, these individuals walked a razor's edge, tasked with entertaining nobles, soothing tempers, and delivering the kind of truths no one else dared whisper. They were comedy's gladiators, fighting not with swords, but with words, and often gambling their lives on a single punchline. To understand the jester, we need to forget the sanitized stage performances and Shakespearean comic reliefs. A medieval jester didn't have a script, a safety net, or a director. They were expected to improvise, on the spot in front of lords and ladies, often with real consequences looming in the shadows. Every joke they made could be their last, and yet somehow they persisted. Their role was to make kings laugh during wars, cheer up queens in mourning, and occasionally poke holes in the pomp of royal egos. But all of that had to be done carefully, cloaked in charm and wrapped in just enough absurdity to protect their heads. This was not a job one stumbled into lightly. For many jesters, it wasn't even a choice. Some were discovered in the streets, clever peasants who caught a noble's eye. Others were captives of war, handed over as part of peace offerings, repurposed from battlefield to ballroom. And tragically, a significant number were people with physical or mental differences, exploited for their appearance or behaviour, and pressed into lives of forced performance. For those people, laughter wasn't a reward, it was a cage. Even for those who chose the path willingly, the stakes were high. A jester had to be a master of more than comedy. They needed to sing, dance, juggle, mimic, and often play multiple musical instruments. They had to read the mood of a room faster than any diplomat. Were the nobles drunk, angry, mourning, on edge from court politics or the threat of war? One wrong word and you might find yourself thrown in the dungeon, or simply disappeared, your name scrubbed from the record. But why would someone take such a job at all? Because surprisingly, when it paid well. Some court jesters earned the equivalent of £10 to £20 a year at a time, when a common labourer scraped by on two. And there were bonuses: land, food, barrels of ale, fancy clothing, and sometimes even gold. One particularly lucky jester was granted a gallon of beer every day for life. Another had their own house near the palace gates. Not bad for someone who made fart jokes for a living. But these were the exceptions. Many jesters received little more than table scraps, worn shoes, and a lumpy mat by the fireplace. So, who were these people really? They were complex, strategic, and deeply human. Their humour often masked sorrow, fear, or exhaustion. They used wit as a shield and performance as a form of therapy, for themselves and the entire court. Jesters brought levity to a brutal world, giving kings a reason to pause before swinging the sword, and peasants a moment of laughter amid starvation and plague. In this first part of our journey, we've peeled back the painted smile of the medieval jester and seen the layers beneath. Not just a fool in bells and tights, but a survivor, a messenger, a master of timing, and above all, a human being with the sharpest mind in the castle and the most precarious job in history. So, rest easy now. Let the image of the jester shift in your mind, from cartoon clown to cunning courtier. And as you drift off, remember, even in the darkest times, someone stood at the centre of the storm, juggling both truth and laughter. As we settle deeper into tonight's journey, let's step beyond the jester's painted smile and jingling bells and peer into the real toolkit of their trade. Because being a jester wasn't about cracking a joke and hoping for applause, it was about survival, persuasion, and performance under pressure. And to survive in the medieval courts, where power shifted like sand beneath your feet, you had to be more than funny. You had to be a one-person variety show, diplomat, therapist, and mind reader, all wrapped in colourful clothing. Let's start with the basics. Music. If you couldn't sing a ballad or strum a lute, you didn't stand a chance. Many jesters were expected to perform music for hours, not just cheerful tunes, but entire narratives, songs of kings long dead, tragic lovers, battles lost and won. And they didn't just sing these ballads, they performed them, turning every verse into a theatrical moment, a shift in tone, a dramatic glance, a pause for breath, all perfectly timed to keep a room full of nobles entertained long enough to forget the frost seeping into the castle stones. Next came dancing. Jesters had to move, not just for show, but to capture attention. A room full of distracted lords might not hear your words, but they'd notice your footwork. From energetic reels to subtle mimed gestures, movement was a form of communication. It could suggest joy, satire, sorrow, or mockery, all without saying a word. The dance was the hook. The punchline would come later. Then there was juggling, which was less about fun and more about finesse. You see, juggling wasn't always about brightly coloured balls or pins. Sometimes it was knives, sometimes torches, sometimes apples with bits of spoiled meat. It was dangerous, sweaty, and nerve-wracking. But when done well, it silenced a room. Juggling demanded not just physical coordination, but confidence, an ability to control chaos in a world where chaos often ruled. Now we move into more nuanced skills. Mimicry was a dangerous art. A jester who could imitate the voice, gestures, and quirks of a noble or politician had immense power and immense risk. Do it right, and the room roared with laughter. Do it wrong, and you might be accused of treason. Some jesters were so skilled at mimicry they were mistaken for the very people they parodied. That's not comedy. That's espionage with flair. And then we have storytelling, arguably the most essential weapon in the jester's arsenal. Storytelling was where all the skills came together: voice, timing, emotion, expression. A jester's story might be a veiled critique of a recent royal decision. It might contain warnings about betrayal, cautionary fables, or commentary about court scandals. But it was never just a story. It was a test of how well the jester knew the room, how subtly they could embed truth in fiction, and how gracefully they could step back if the tension rose too high. Improvisation was the lifeblood of the jester's craft. You couldn't rehearse for every scenario. A noble might insult you out of nowhere. A feast might turn sombre after bad news. A rival might try to upstage you. And in those moments, you had seconds to react. Say something witty, disarm the tension, steer the mood, freeze, and the silence could be deadly, literally. And let's not forget sound effects and puppetry, two highly underrated skills. A good jester could simulate animal noises, mimic weather, create entire scenes with their voice. Puppets, meanwhile, could allow them to speak truths too dangerous to say themselves. A puppet wasn't a toy, it was a legal loophole. The puppet said it, not me, they might joke. Everyone laughed, but the meaning hung heavy in the room. Jesters also had to create a signature routine, a recognizable performance they could return to when times were tense. Something safe, something comforting. A comedic character, a routine trick, a familiar joke. That consistency wasn't just entertainment, it was strategy. It gave nobles a reason to smile, even when the world outside the castle was crumbling. So, when we talk about jesters, let's throw away the idea of a clown stumbling through a joke. Think of them more like a Swiss Army knife of performance. They had to engage, distract, soothe, inspire, and survive. Their value wasn't in being silly, it was in being indispensable. They held the attention of rulers, courtiers, and commoners alike. They read people better than most spies. They move between laughter and danger like dancers on a tightrope. As you ease into your rest tonight, maybe take a quiet moment to imagine what it would feel like to carry that weight. To be the one person everyone expects to laugh, while inside you're calculating, adjusting, surviving. The Jester's smile was real, but it was also a mask. Behind it, a performer whose act was never just a show. So now that we know just how skilled, sharp and multifaceted a jester had to be, the natural question is, how did someone become one? Because surely no little medieval boy or girl stood up in a smoky peasant cottage and proudly declared, "I want to risk my life making nobles laugh," right? Well, not exactly. The truth is, the path to becoming a jester was rarely straight, and it was almost never voluntary in the way we think of choosing a career today. For many, jesting wasn't a job they chased, it was a role that chased them down. Sometimes it was luck, sometimes it was survival, and sometimes it was sheer exploitation. Let's start with the most fortunate route, talent recognised by nobility. Picture a peasant performing in a village square, juggling stones, mimicking the grumpy priest, singing songs that make the innkeeper weep. A passing noble might pause, amused, intrigued, maybe even impressed. If the noble had a good eye for entertainment, or simply wanted a new toy for court, they might offer the performer a chance to come back with them. This sounds like a Cinderella story at first, plucked from poverty, given food, clothes, an audience. But it wasn't exactly a dream. It meant leaving behind everything familiar. It meant becoming a servant in fancy clothing. You were owned, in a sense. Expected to be funny, loyal, and silent about the things you saw, and if you didn't measure up, you could be sent away, or worse, with barely a footnote in history. Now let's take a darker path. Coercion. Some jesters didn't choose anything. They were prisoners of war. Imagine two kingdoms at war. One side wins. Among the captives, maybe there's someone who's unusually clever, or just unusual. Maybe they had a sharp tongue during their capture. Maybe they kept spirits high in the dungeon with songs and stories. A noble takes notice. Instead of execution, they're given as a gift. Not gold, not livestock. A human, handed over like a novelty item. Here, my lord. He made us laugh during the march. Perhaps he'll do the same for you. Or consider another category, those born with physical differences or disabilities. In many courts, people with dwarfism or noticeable conditions were considered exotic or amusing by the deeply flawed standards of the time. Some were enslaved or forced into performance roles. They weren't hired, they were displayed, and often mocked, even as they were expected to entertain. They might be paired with animals, dressed in exaggerated costumes, or used in cruel games that had nothing to do with wit or skill. These weren't jesters in the empowered sense. These were victims placed on a stage they couldn't step down from. But not all stories were tragic. Some people chose the role, fully aware of its dangers. Why? Because being a jester, even with all the risks, offered something few other jobs did: a voice. In a society where most people were invisible to power, jesters had access to the highest rooms in the kingdom. They could speak to royalty, they could shape narratives, they could be remembered, even if just for a while. Some of the most famous jesters in history were self-made performers who honed their craft travelling town to town before finally catching the eye of a court. These were individuals who loved the game, the thrill of it, who knew how to walk the razor's edge between bravery and stupidity, and make it look like a dance. But make no mistake, regardless of how you got there, the transformation into a jester was total. You didn't just become a jester, you were turned into one, through pressure, through praise, through punishment. Your name might be stripped away, you might be given a costume, a stage name, a set of expectations you could never shake. You were no longer a man, a woman, a child. You were the fool, and everyone would watch to see what you'd do next. Once you entered that world, leaving was difficult. Very few jesters retired, very few aged into comfort. You were useful, or you were forgotten. Your body, your voice, your personality, these were your tools, and once they dulled, the world moved on. As you settle deeper into rest, picture the faces of those jesters, not the painted ones we imagine, but the real ones. Tired eyes, calloused hands, bruises hidden beneath silk. People who were funny not because life was easy, but because it was hard. People who turned their pain into performance. People who laughed first, so no one would see them cry. As we drift further into the flickering candlelight of the medieval world, let's walk with the jester as he, yes, sometimes she too, enters the most dangerous and dazzling stage of all, the royal court. Because while a jester's job was laughter, their workplace was no comedy club. It was a throne room. It was a battlefield. It was a place where words were weapons and smiles could hide swords. Now, at first glance, the life of a court jester might seem enviable. You're indoors, already a step up from the wandering fools braving storms and sleeping beside dying campfires. You're rubbing elbows with the most powerful people in the land. There's roasted meat on the table, goblets of wine, music, heat from the hearth, gold-threaded drapes. You're not toiling in fields or dying in the mud of a forgotten war, but scratch the surface and the silk starts to fray. Because at court every moment was a performance, and every performance was a test. Jesters were expected to be on call at any hour. Literally. There are records of jesters being woken up in the middle of the night to cheer up a brooding king, perhaps after a lost battle, a bad dream, or just boredom. Imagine being dragged from sleep, thrown into torchlight, and expected to make a monarch belly laugh. One wrong word, one misread mood, and you could be sent back to your chambers bleeding, or not sent back at all. They were more than performers. They were scapegoats. When a noble was angry or drunk or humiliated, guess who got to lighten the mood? The jester. Guess who got slapped, kicked, mocked in return? The jester. They were emotional lightning rods, absorbing the frustrations of an elite class trained never to appear weak in front of their peers. The jester could be mocked. That was their job, so others didn't have to be. But here's the paradox. The very thing that made jesters low status, being ridiculed, also gave them a strange kind of power. They could say things no one else dared. They could tease a king about his failures, whisper truths behind a smirk, tell jokes that doubled as warnings. In some courts, the jester was the only one who could tell the monarch the truth, so long as he wrapped it in enough wit to make it look like a joke. Imagine walking that tightrope every day. To survive, jesters had to be more than funny. They had to be readers of the room, master psychologists. They noticed when a noble had too much wine, when tensions were high between political factions, when someone had just been executed, or someone else was about to be, and in those moments they chose their words with surgical precision. Too soft and the court yawns, too sharp and your head's on the block. Court was also a nest of politics. Nobles competed for influence, loyalties shifted with the wind, and jesters hovering on the edges saw everything. Some courts used jesters as spies, passing messages under the guise of humour. Others used them as distractions, diverting attention from backroom deals. Some jesters even became trusted advisors, their comedic masks hiding brilliant political minds. But don't let that fool you. Their position was always precarious. The average court jester lasted just 4 years. That's it. 4 years of dancing, joking, teasing kings and dodging danger, before being dismissed, replaced or quietly disappearing. Dismissal could be for anything. Telling an offensive joke, failing to make the queen laugh during her illness, getting too close to the wrong noble, or simply aging. A jester was expected to be quick on his feet, literally and metaphorically. Wrinkles, a limp or a slowing tongue were career enders, and unlike the nobles, jesters had no pensions, no retirement. When they were no longer amusing, they were discarded, sometimes allowed to stay on in some ceremonial role, dressed up but silent like living decorations. More often, they were sent away with nothing, just another face forgotten in history's margins. Still, some jesters defied the odds. They navigated the serpentine corridors of power like seasoned diplomats, disguised in bells and motley. They made kings pause. They made courtiers blush. They made enemies laugh when swords were half drawn. They survived. As you settle deeper into your pillow, think of them, standing in cold stone halls, heart pounding beneath bright-coloured fabric, eyes flicking from face to face, reading each expression, calculating each breath, delivering one perfect line that could make a room erupt in laughter, or silence. And in that silence, their fate hung. It wasn't just a job, it was an act of constant survival, and those who mastered it, they weren't just entertainers, they were the most dangerous kind of genius, the kind that makes power laugh while holding up a mirror. So here we are, floating gently through the winding corridors of medieval castles, and in this part of our journey we peel back another layer of the jester's painted smile. Because despite the bells on their hats and the jokes on their lips, jesters were far more than entertainers. Tonight we explore how they were also messengers, emotional regulators, and sometimes the only source of unfiltered truth in a room full of liars. Let's start with a curious fact. Jesters didn't just deliver punchlines, they delivered news, tax announcements, battle defeats, public executions, political changes, all that heavy, complicated, often terrible information that no one really wanted to hear. It was sometimes the jester's job to say it, but not directly, not seriously. Instead, they wrapped it in rhyme, turned it into satire, hid it in a story, and told it with a grin. Because here's the reality. Kings and nobles could tolerate hard truths, but only if they were sweetened first, and jesters were expert sugarcoaters. Imagine the challenge. Let's say the king has just lost a campaign in the north. Hundreds of men dead, gold spent, morale crushed. No one wants to tell him. No knight, no advisor, no noble dares speak. So, they turn to the jester. He walks into the chamber, bells jingling, face lit by firelight. He bows low. And then he tells a story about a brave rooster who marched into a dog's territory and came home featherless. The king listens, chuckles, understands, and no one gets beheaded. The jester has just performed a small miracle. In this role, jesters became a strange blend of comedian and counsellor. Their purpose wasn't just to provoke laughter, it was to protect the emotional state of the powerful. When a monarch was angry, anxious, or slipping into paranoia, it was the jester's job to ease that tension, to keep the room light, to remind everyone that joy, even dark humour, still existed. They were quite literally emotional surge protectors. The stakes were high. Too much sadness or tension in a royal court could lead to irrational decisions, bad policies, even war. A clever jester could de-escalate a feud with a single line. They might throw themselves into the crossfire of noble rivalries, joking at just the right moment to break the mood and redirect attention. And in doing so, they may have saved lives, never gotten credit for it. Even more intriguingly, some jesters became advisors, trusted not despite their jokes, but because of them. A joke can say what a formal letter never could. A good jest can expose hypocrisy, test loyalty, or reveal weakness. In a time when everyone wore masks, literal and social, jesters were often the only ones allowed to speak plainly. They could mock a policy without punishment. They could ask the stupid question that exposed a fatal flaw in a plan. They could pretend to be ignorant while making everyone else uncomfortable with their insights. And when a jester teased a king, and the king laughed, everyone else in the room took note. That laughter was a message. It said, "This is safe to talk about now." Or conversely, "Don't take yourself too seriously." In this way, jesters shaped the mood of the entire court. They also served as mirrors. Imagine being surrounded every day by people who flatter you, bow to you, praise your every move. How do you stay grounded? How do you see yourself clearly? Sometimes only a jester could offer that reflection. Through parody, through mimicry, through exaggerated impersonations. Some jesters would even dress like their king, mocking his walk, voice, habits. If the king laughed, it showed confidence. If he didn't, it revealed insecurity. Either way, the jester revealed something valuable. There were risks, of course. The line between truth and offence was razor thin. Say the wrong thing, and the jester could be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. But the best ones knew how to walk that line. They were masters of subtext, reading body language, watching every eyebrow twitch and sigh. And when the time came, they could turn even despair into dark humour. In plague-ridden towns and war-torn courts, jesters made jokes about death, disease, filth, and fear. Not because they were insensitive, but because they understood the power of laughing with your suffering. It was a kind of defiance, a way to say, "You haven't taken everything from me, I can still laugh." That kind of laughter, it's not just comedy, it's resilience. So, as you lie there, eyes half closed, think of the jester not just as the silly man in motley, juggling for coins, but as the nervous messenger carrying dangerous news, as the midnight performer soothing a king's broken heart, as the only one in the room brave enough to speak the truth under the cover of laughter. Because in a world where power crushed dissent and fear ruled silently, the jester had a different weapon, one sharper than a sword, sharper even than a tongue, laughter, with a secret message folded inside. And with that we'll gently move onward into part 6, where we explore the rewards, payments and bizarre perks that came with the jester's perilous job. Some of it gold, some of it beer, some of it just plain weird. Welcome back, my sleepy historians. Let's slip back into that candlelit chamber, with its stone walls and chilly draughts, and imagine once again the jingle of bells echoing down a torchlit hallway. Tonight, in part 6, we're going to talk about something far less whimsical than juggling, and far more essential to survival. Money. Well, money, and beer, and pigs, and sometimes a whole cow. Because while we often picture medieval jesters as colourful clowns playing for fun, the truth is their job came with a paycheck, or at least some version of one, and as with all things in the Middle Ages, what you earned depended heavily on who you entertained. Let's start with the courts, where jesters served kings, dukes, barons and other noble households. These weren't street performers passing a hat around for coins. No, court jesters were technically staff. They were on the payroll. And in 14th century England, a talented jester could earn between £10 and £20 a year. Now, that might not sound like much, but let's put it in context. At that time, a typical labourer, someone working fields or swinging a hammer, might earn only £2 a year. That means jesters were making 5 to 10 times more than the average working class person. That's substantial. It meant access to better food, warmer clothing, and the faintest hope of someday maybe not working. Of course, that hope rarely came true, and it wasn't just silver coins they earned. Some jesters were paid in perks. One jester, for example, was given a gallon of beer every single day for the rest of his life. Another received a cow from a grateful lord. Others were gifted land, livestock, barrels of wine or fine clothing, the medieval equivalent of a bonus check and a company car. It was never consistent. One king might be generous, another might be broke. The rewards were wildly uneven and often depended on how valuable, or entertaining, you were to your employer. Some jesters also received luxury foods, like roasted meats, spices, and honey cakes. Not always, of course. Often they got the same meagre portions as other staff. But when they were in favour, their meals could rival that of minor nobility. That said, it could all disappear very quickly. The average tenure for a court jester was around 4 years. That's how long they typically lasted before being dismissed, replaced, or simply vanishing from the record. Sometimes they were fired, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes, well, let's just say the history books stopped mentioning them, which in medieval times was rarely a good sign. Because their job was risky. One bad joke could lead to punishment or disgrace, so saving money, planning for retirement was nearly impossible. Most jesters did not end their careers in comfort. A lucky few might be allowed to stay on as old men, given a little food and a cot in the corner. But most didn't make it that far. They either died in service or were cast out to fend for themselves. Then, of course, there were the wandering jesters, the street performers who roamed from town to town. For them, life was even harder. They didn't have a noble's protection or a guaranteed wage. They performed in village squares, inns, or festival markets, hoping for tips. Sometimes they earned a few coins, sometimes nothing at all. They often slept outdoors, went hungry, and faced threats from bandits, illness, or angry mobs who didn't like their humour. Their payment? Pure survival. Occasionally, they might be offered food or shelter for a particularly good performance, a bed of straw in a barn, a heel of bread, a bowl of stew, but it was unreliable and fiercely competitive. Performers fought over prime locations, sometimes literally. In some towns, brawls broke out between rival jesters or performance groups, each fighting for the best place to earn a handful of coins. So while we like to imagine jesters as carefree jokers, the reality was anything but. Every laugh came with a price, every performance was a gamble, and every coin they earned had to be stretched across cold winters, bad harvests, and uncertain futures. Some jesters did manage to climb the social ladder a bit, especially those who served powerful kings or gained fame across regions. But these were the exceptions. Most remained just outside the edge of poverty, always a few bad nights away from ruin. Yet still, they danced, they sang, they mimicked and mocked and made others laugh because it was the only currency they truly controlled. They turned their cleverness into coin, their humiliation into dinner, their sharp tongues into security. And for some, that was enough. As you close your eyes and drift deeper into tonight's gentle shadows, think of the jester not just as a fool in motley, but as a hustler, a negotiator, a performer for hire who bartered his own body and brain for bread. In the next part we'll explore their living conditions, the strange and often grim realities of castle life, and how disease, poor hygiene and dark humour shape the jester's daily world. We're deep into the winding halls of medieval life now, and tonight we pause to consider not just the people, but the places, the very stone and straw that surrounded the jester from dawn to dusk. Because behind the glitter of court life and the echo of laughter lies a much colder, messier truth. Tonight, in Part 7, we explore what it actually felt like to live as a jester in the Middle Ages, the sounds, the smells, the discomforts, and the dark humour that got them through it all. Let's start with the castles. Now, the word castle might conjure images of grandeur, towering stone walls, flickering chandeliers, roaring fireplaces. But the real medieval castle, it was cold, dark, and profoundly uncomfortable. Stone doesn't retain heat, and most castles were draughty, damp, and poorly ventilated. Even in summer, there was often a chill in the air. In winter, let's just say people layered not for fashion, but for survival. Jesters, like most of the court servants, rarely had private rooms. They slept wherever space allowed, on floors, in corners, sometimes even in shared servant quarters, where dozens of bodies packed together for warmth. Mattresses were straw-filled sacks at best, often crawling with lice and mice. Personal privacy was a luxury almost no one below nobility enjoyed. And then there were the smells. Medieval sanitation was, by modern standards, practically non-existent. Castles were full of animals, people and refuse. Chamber pots were dumped out of windows into moats or cesspits, sometimes flooding courtyards with waste. The kitchens were smoky, the latrines barely functional, and the halls thick with the scent of sweat, wood smoke, spoiled meat, and old beer. Even jesters, who were technically part of the inner circle, had to endure these odours daily. They ate in the same halls, shared the same wash basins, if there were any, and walked the same slippery flagstones soaked with rain and filth. As for food, the meals varied wildly. If you were a favoured jester, you might dine with nobles or be given plates of roasted meats, honeyed bread, even imported spices. But most days you were more likely to receive what was left over: gristle, stale bread, cold stew thick with turnips and onions. Water was dangerous to drink, often riddled with bacteria, so most people drank weak ale instead, even jesters. And that constant exposure to poor hygiene, it had a cost. Respiratory issues were common. The smoke from open fires and candles hung in the air day and night. Dental problems were widespread too. Rotting teeth, painful abscesses, and no hope of real treatment. Minor wounds could turn fatal without antibiotics, and jesters, known for their physical performances, often suffered sprains, bruises, or worse. Twisted ankles from a misstep, cracked ribs from a tumble. Each injury carried serious risk, and if that weren't enough, jesters were sometimes sent to entertain the sick, including victims of the plague. Kings and nobles believed laughter might ward off death, or at least lift the spirits of the dying. But for the jester, it meant walking straight into infection. Some did it gladly, some were coerced, but many likely didn't return from such performances. Despite it all, jesters coped the only way they knew how, through humour. And in a world full of death, disease and decay, dark humour reigned supreme. They joked about plague boils, chamber pots, dying nobles, and the endless stupidity of humanity. Nothing was sacred, because in the bleakness of their daily lives, laughter wasn't just entertainment, it was a shield, a weapon, a survival mechanism. People wanted to laugh at the horror. They needed it, and jesters delivered. Poop jokes, plague jokes, jabs at the king's smell or the bishop's belly, all part of the repertoire. Crude, yes, but honest, raw, deeply connected to the lived reality of a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed. And so the jester put on the mask, smiled through pain, danced in filth, and laughed with missing teeth. They sang in the draughty halls, juggled through fevers, and cracked jokes while the castle crumbled around them, because that was the job. Not to escape the darkness, but to make it funny. And as strange as it sounds, this gave them a kind of power. In a court filled with posturing and fear, the jester could name what no one else dared to, the absurdity of it all. So as you drift to sleep tonight, wrapped in clean sheets, listening to gentle narration, remember the jester lying on a pile of straw centuries ago. Body aching, belly half full, yet still whispering jokes into the night. Because sometimes, a laugh is the only warmth you have. Welcome back, Night Traveller. We're getting closer now, not just to understanding what the jester was, but to feeling what it meant to carry that role every day, year after year. By now you've walked with them through the cold halls of the castle, you've tasted the bitterness of their life behind the jokes, and tonight in Part 8a we begin to uncover something unexpected. The jester was not just an entertainer. Sometimes they were a voice in the shadows, a messenger, a truth-teller, even a counsellor to kings. Let's dim the lights together and ease into the soft rhythm of history. You see, the court jester's value didn't end at slapstick or silly songs. Beneath the juggling and rhyme was something deeper, something dangerous. In a world where speaking against power could lead to execution, the jester alone had a special license to mock authority. But this privilege came with enormous risk and enormous responsibility. In medieval courts, politics was like walking a tightrope. Nobles and advisors tiptoed around monarchs, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Flattery was common. Caution was survival. But kings and queens, especially the more intelligent ones, knew that sycophants couldn't be trusted. They needed at least one person in their orbit who could say the truth aloud without being thrown into a dungeon, and that person was often the jester. Let's pause here. Imagine a moment. The great hall is quiet. A foreign dignitary has just left after hours of tense negotiation. The king is brooding. Advisors are whispering what they think he wants to hear. But the jester, he steps forward and says something like, "Well, my liege, if we bend any further, perhaps we should just offer them your throne along with dinner." It's bold, it's biting, but it's wrapped in humour, and that's the key. Jesters disguise truth with laughter. They could highlight a king's poor decision, call attention to corruption, or even criticise war efforts, all by couching it in a joke. This wasn't just entertainment, it was strategy. It was politics with a painted smile. Sometimes the jester was tasked with saying what no one else could. Delivering bad news was another grim duty. When a battle was lost, or new taxes imposed, it was the jester who might be sent to announce it to the court, because if anyone could soften the blow, it was the one who made people laugh. They'd deliver the grim truth with flair, punchlines and parody, turning gasps into groans and tears into chuckles. It didn't always work, but often it helped. In many ways, this made jesters emotional barometers. They had to sense the mood of the room, the heart of the king, the fears of the people, and find ways to speak into it without being silenced. That's not just talent. That's empathy. That's intuition honed over years of surviving the most dangerous audiences in Europe. But not all jesters survived. You see, while they had permission to speak freely, it wasn't a shield. If the jester misread the moment, if they made the wrong joke at the wrong time, it could still end badly. Some were beaten, imprisoned, or simply vanished from records after offending their masters. Freedom of speech didn't exist. It was more like freedom on a leash, and the leash could tighten quickly. Still, jesters kept walking that line. They learned how to present difficult truths like gifts, wrapped in humour, trimmed with timing, and delivered with exaggerated humility. "I'm just a fool," they'd say, bowing low. "What do I know?" But they knew, they knew a lot. In fact, some jesters became trusted advisors, hidden behind the mask of comedy. Monarchs would call them into private chambers and ask for honest opinions, on politics, marriages, even warfare. Why? Because jesters didn't have noble family ties. They weren't scheming for titles or power. Their insights were sharp, unfiltered, and rooted in observation. They watched everything. They heard the whispers in the halls. They saw the shift in a general's posture. They noted the tremble in a noble's voice, and they remembered. That's the thing about jesters. They weren't just performers. They were witnesses to everything that passed through the court. Love affairs, betrayals, deals struck in shadow. They were the eyes and ears beneath the throne, and if they were clever, they could turn those observations into influence. So tonight, as you drift, think of that jester, not dancing, not laughing, but standing beside a king's throne, speaking words no one else dares to say, smiling through danger, telling truth with a sparkle in the eye and a bell on the hat. Because jesters, more than almost anyone, knew the power of words. Welcome back, friend. You've stayed with us through winding corridors of stone, the flicker of torchlight, and the sound of bells echoing down castle halls. Tonight in Part 8b, we continue where we left off, with the jester no longer a mere figure of fun, but something far more layered. A quiet whisper in a loud court. A performer, yes, but also a manipulator of mood, a mirror for monarchs, a chess piece that moved diagonally through the game of power. Let's lie back, get cozy, and slip a little deeper into the world of subtle influence and strategic foolishness. In many ways, jesters were emotional regulators for the most powerful people in the land. Kings didn't have therapists. Queens didn't get spa weekends. Their lives were wrapped in duty, expectation, and a constant awareness of enemies, some outside their castles, many within. And in that world of pressure and performance, jesters became the only people allowed to bring them emotional release. Some nights that release came in laughter, other nights it came in tears. But the jester's job was always the same. Find the pressure point and gently, sometimes not so gently, press it. Let's imagine a different kind of performance. No slapstick, no juggling. Instead, a single jester sits in a quiet room with the king. The air is heavy. A war has just ended, and the cost in lives is impossible to ignore. The jester begins to speak, not with jokes, but with a story. Maybe it's about a foolish general in a far-off land. Maybe it's about a talking pig who runs a kingdom and leads it straight into ruin. The story is absurd, yes, but familiar. It stings. And then the jester says, "But what do I know? I'm only a fool." The king says nothing, Rüstamd. But the message has landed. That was the genius of a great jester. They didn't push. They didn't preach. They let you arrive at the truth yourself, often by laughing first. And once you laughed, once your guard was down, they slipped in the meaning. Their jokes were Trojan horses, and inside was the wisdom you didn't know you needed. Some jesters were so skilled at this that they earned the ear of the monarch not just in the great hall but in private. They became confidants, listeners, even low-key advisors, not because they were trained in diplomacy, but because they understood people. They understood emotion, and they understood power. A few rare jesters over time began to shape policy, not with decrees or commands, but with carefully chosen words at just the right moment. There are tales of jesters who warned kings about betrayals, who convinced monarchs to ease punishments, or who gently nudged rulers toward peace instead of war. They were not always successful, but sometimes they were. This role as an influencer came with an unspoken rule. Never forget you're expendable. Jesters weren't nobles, they had no titles, no armies, no inherited lands. Their power lived entirely in performance, and the moment they failed to entertain or push too far, that power vanished. If a king laughed at your story today, he might frown at it tomorrow, and if he frowned, that could be the end. So jesters had to be masters of emotional intelligence. They had to read the temperature of the room the way a sailor reads the wind. Too light, and you're forgettable. Too heavy, and you're a threat. Just right, and you might survive another day, maybe even become essential. This balancing act is what made their position so tragic and so fascinating. Because while they were technically fools, they were often among the wisest people at court. They saw everything: love affairs blooming in corners, tensions crackling between rival factions, whispers passed behind embroidered sleeves. They knew who was rising, who was falling, who was lying, and who was plotting, and they remembered. Yet they carried all that knowledge inside a painted smile. Their pain, their insight, their intelligence, all hidden beneath the jingle of bells and the laughter of the crowd. Think of how lonely that must have been. To be trusted but not respected. To be listened to but never fully seen. In some rare cases, kings did recognise the brilliance of their jesters and rewarded them. A few were even granted honorary titles, land, or lifelong pensions. But for every jester who found honour, there were dozens who vanished when their usefulness ran out, cast aside like a broken puppet, and yet they kept performing. Because that's what jesters did. They kept showing up. They kept laughing, singing, and telling the truth, softly, sideways, in a joke that echoed longer than anyone expected. So tonight, as the world outside your window fades into stillness, think of that solitary figure standing in a hall full of velvet and steel. A fool, perhaps, but one whose words could shift the hearts of kings. Rest easy knowing that in history, sometimes the smallest voices carried the deepest truths, and in the shadows of power, the jester's candle flickered on. We'll continue soon with part 9, where we'll explore what happened when the laughter stopped, and what punishment really meant for a jester who dared too much. But for now, close your eyes, let the silence take you, and sleep well. Sleepy traveller, I'm glad you're still with us on this winding journey through candlelit courts and echoing castle halls. Tonight, we're entering a slightly darker room in the House of History. Up until now, we've seen the jester as an artist, a performer, even a subtle advisor. But in part 9a, we ask the question, what happened when the laughter stopped? What happens when a joke went too far? Let's set the scene. A medieval banquet hall. The smell of roasted meat and sweat hangs in the air. The nobles are seated, wine sloshing in gilded goblets, while tapestries tremble slightly in the draught. At the head of the table, the king leans back in his carved oak chair, eyes half-lidded with drink. The jester, in his bright motley garb, leaps into the centre of the room. He's juggling apples, mimicking a pompous noble, cracking a joke that has the room howling. Except, not everyone is laughing. One noble's lips are tight, his face pale. He recognises himself in the act. The audience does too. The joke cuts a little too close to the truth, about money mismanaged or an affair half-whispered. Even the king chuckles awkwardly, sensing something dangerous has just been said out loud. The jester finishes the act, bows, and walks out of the room as if nothing has changed. But behind the curtain, everything has changed. You see, in the medieval court, laughter was a double-edged sword. It could entertain, but it could also expose. Jesters were expected to be clever, but not too clever. Bold, but not threatening. They could speak truth, but only if it was wrapped so tightly in humour that it didn't sting too badly. That fine line was different for every ruler, and it moved constantly, like a shadow at sunset. If a jester misread the room, if they said too much, mocked the wrong person, or made the king look foolish, they could find themselves in serious danger. A single joke could cost them everything. In some courts, it meant exile. In others, prison, beatings, or worse. In rare but very real cases, jesters were executed. Yes, executed. Not with fanfare or trial, often quietly, a disappearance from court records, a name never mentioned again, perhaps tossed into a dungeon to rot, perhaps dispatched with a blade in a dark corridor. The only clue might be the sudden appearance of a new jester, and an unspoken warning in the air. Know your place. But here's the twist. Kings needed their jesters. They didn't want to live in silence. They needed someone to break the tension, to call out hypocrisies, to say the things that no noble dared say aloud. So punishment wasn't always immediate, and it wasn't always straightforward. Sometimes punishment came in emotional cruelty. A jester might be mocked in return, stripped of privileges, forced to perform for people they hated. or made the butt of a joke they didn't write. Sometimes they were publicly humiliated, tied to a post, dressed in rags, made to perform like an animal, just to remind everyone, this person is not one of us. This person is tolerated, not respected. There are even accounts of jesters being made to entertain while injured, bruised, bleeding, coughing up sickness, because the king wanted distraction and didn't care what it cost. And through it all, the jester had to smile, had to laugh, had to pretend that everything was fine, even as the weight of the court crushed down. Of course, some jesters learned to work the system. They became masters of subtlety, experts in double meaning. They told jokes with so many layers that only the king understood the insult, and the king liked it. It made him feel clever. These jesters survived longer, but even they knew the truth. One wrong word, one sour mood, and the tide could turn. So as you drift deeper into sleep tonight, think about that fragile balance. Imagine what it must have felt like to live each day knowing that your livelihood and your life depended on laughter. Not just getting it, but controlling it, guiding it, keeping it just sharp enough to be clever, but never so sharp it cut too deep. The jester danced on a blade, and the court watched with bated breath. Let's return now, quiet and unhurried, to those same flickering candlelit halls where jesters once performed, always dancing on a thread stretched thin between laughter and peril. By now, we know their craft wasn't merely about jokes or juggling, it was about survival. Every jest was a gamble, and the stakes? Everything. In the world of the medieval court, punishment wore many masks. It wasn't always swift or dramatic. Sometimes it arrived silently, like a sudden chill in the air or a gaze that lingered a little too long from a powerful noble. For a jester, even a moment of hesitation in performance could be misread as insolence. A pause too long between laughs could turn the warmth of the crowd cold. Court life was less like a performance stage and more like a chessboard where each smile had consequences. Take, for instance, the strange reality that jesters were often expected to be present in their monarch's most vulnerable moments, sleepless nights, moments of rage, grief, or political anxiety. A misplaced joke at the wrong hour could snap a fragile thread in a king's mind. When emotions ran high, especially in times of war or scandal, a jester could suddenly become the target of accumulated frustration. And what then? Not every punishment was physical. A king who grew tired of his fool might simply stop acknowledging him. No eye contact, no invitations to perform, a slow erasure from court life. A once favoured jester might find himself excluded from banquets, isolated from friends, and spoken of in past tense even while still breathing the same stale castle air. Others were punished in ways that left more visible scars. Records from across Europe show jesters being beaten, shackled, or thrown into cold, damp cells for a joke perceived as treason. Their colourful garb couldn't shield them from the darker side of the royal moods. And in some courts there were more creative methods, mock trials, forced public apologies, or humiliations staged as entertainment. One chilling account speaks of a jester made to perform on a frozen lake during winter as nobles looked on in amusement. Another was allegedly locked in a cage hung from the castle wall for days, left to freeze, starve, and reflect on his improper jest. Whether these tales have been stretched over time or not, the message beneath remains. Jesters lived at the mercy of their patrons' tempers. And yet, it wasn't only kings they had to watch. Nobles, generals, foreign diplomats, even rival entertainers could wield influence. A powerful courtier, insulted by mimicry or implication, might whisper to the king that the jester was spreading dissent or mocking sacred institutions. In such cases, punishment could come not from outrage but from quiet political manoeuvring, a backroom decision, a new law conveniently enforced, a message delivered in the dead of night that the fool was no longer welcome. In some courts, punishment came with a strange irony. Jesters were made to joke about their own punishment. Imagine for a moment a bruised performer forced to reenact his crime as a comedy for those who condemned him. Laughter weaponized to make suffering seem palatable. And then there were those who simply vanished. One day they performed, the next they didn't. Their names vanished from records, their stories left untold. No farewell performance, no pension, just silence. Perhaps they were sent away. Perhaps they met a quiet end in a place no one would ever think to look. The court moved on. The next feast had a new jester, and history, ever forgetful of the unglamorous, let their memory dissolve. Still, through all of this, through fear, risk, and humiliation, jesters kept performing. Not because they were fools, but because they were brilliant, strategic, brave. They endured because their art was more than diversion. It was survival. Every clever word, every outrageous act, every tightly timed performance was an attempt to claim another day of safety, of relevance, of life. So tonight, as we lie still and the world outside quiets, think of those jesters not just as clowns in colourful hats, but as masterful readers of people, as boundary pushers, as emotional labourers whose currency was wit, but whose reality was often soaked in dread. They carried the laughter of courts on their backs, at the cost of their own peace, and still they bowed, smiled, danced, and sometimes they disappeared. Hello again, my quiet friend. You've made it through the grand stone halls, across velvet-draped courts, and past the dangerous dance of power and performance. But not every jester had a royal patron. Not every fool wore motley for kings and queens. Tonight, in part 10a, we begin to follow a different kind of performer, the wandering jester. A traveller with nothing but a pack of props, a head full of rhymes, and a heart that beat in rhythm with the road. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let the castle fade behind you, and picture a muddy path cutting through the countryside, lined by wildflowers, dipping into small muddy villages, winding past forests where wolves still howl in the distance. Along that path walks a man or a woman, maybe with a monkey on one shoulder or a sack of puppets slung across their back. They wear faded colours, patched sleeves, and worn shoes. The cloak might be more holes than fabric, but their steps are light, because tonight there's a chance for coin. Wandering jesters, sometimes called fools, minstrels, gleemen or jongleurs, lived on the very edges of medieval society. They weren't tied to a lord or castle. They answered to no king. Instead, they answered to the crowds, the people in the market square, the rowdy drinkers in the tavern, the curious children leaning out of windows as a stranger rolled into town with stories and tricks. Now that might sound romantic. The open road, freedom, art for the people. But the truth, as always, is more complicated. Life for a wandering jester was brutally hard. There was no guaranteed income, no roof over your head, no warm feast at the end of the night unless you earned it with laughter or wonder. These performers competed fiercely for attention in bustling spaces, and the public. They could be just as cruel as any court. If your act was boring, or your timing off, you might get heckled, booed, even pelted with scraps. And if your jokes hit too close to home, mocked the wrong churchman or questioned the local lord's taxes, you might not make it to the next village at all. Wandering jesters had to be quick on their feet, literally and metaphorically. They performed in open-air markets, on the backs of wagons, outside taverns, or during fairs and festivals. The best ones memorized dozens, sometimes hundreds, of different routines. Puppet plays, riddles, mimicry, dances, songs, and always, improvisation. They had to adapt their act for farmers one day, noble visitors the next, and drunken brawlers the day after. Some travelled alone, others joined loose troops, bands of musicians, jugglers and actors. These groups offered a bit of safety in numbers, especially when travelling through unfamiliar or unfriendly towns. But they also came with rivalries. Performers competed fiercely for the best spots, near the tavern entrance, under the cathedral's shadow, beside the mayor's booth during festival days. Fights broke out, props were stolen, even songs were plagiarised, and yet through all of this these travelling fools kept going. Because for some, there was no alternative. Many wandering jesters were former peasants who fled hardship or outlaws seeking a new identity. Others were discharged soldiers using their war experience to tell battle tales for coin. Some had been kicked out of court or orphaned young. Still others were born into performance families, learning their father's juggling act or their mother's puppet voices from the time they could walk. Their road was long and uncertain, Illness lurked around every corner. Bad water, spoiled food, and cold rains that soaked to the bone. Inns were too expensive, and barn floors, when available, were a luxury. Most nights were spent under trees curled near a fire that barely stayed lit. Many jesters died young, exposure, hunger, or just a town's cruelty. But in those rare moments when everything went right, the crowd was lively, the punchlines landed, the coins jingled, there was a kind of magic in the air. For a moment the jester had power, the power to make strangers smile, to make tired people laugh, to poke gentle fun at the world and remind everyone, if only for an evening, that life was absurd and ridiculous and worth singing about. So tonight, we follow these unknown names on their muddy paths. We remember the ones who danced and juggled for bread, who sang for silver, who carried humour on their backs like travelling merchants carried spice and silk. In the last part, we walked beside the wandering jesters, those brave, strange, and stubborn performers who chose, or were forced, to make the open road their stage. Now let's settle in even deeper. Because while the castles and courts may have had firelit halls and polished shoes, the life of the travelling fool was far colder, far messier, and far more human. Tonight, let's follow one of these jesters not just during their show, but between the shows. Imagine it's a muddy spring morning, the kind where mist clings to the fields like a worn blanket and the roads are half flooded. Our jester wakes stiff and sore beneath a tree. Their costume, once bright, is damp, and their props, tucked in a bag or wagon, are flecked with dirt. They slept with one eye open. Bandits, wild dogs, and even drunken villagers have been known to attack travellers for less. There's no applause in the morning, no silver coins from kind nobles, just the task of walking to the next village, hoping it has a market or fair, and that the people there are in a laughing mood. Wandering jesters had to hustle constantly. Entertainment was their only currency. If the weather was bad, if the crowd was grumpy, or if another performer had already passed through and spoiled the mood, a jester might go hungry. They couldn't afford to repeat the same act too many times in nearby towns. Word travelled fast. Variety wasn't just preferred, it was essential for survival. And remember, medieval towns could be deeply superstitious. Jesters, with their strange clothing and odd behaviour, often stirred suspicion. Some were accused of witchcraft, especially if they had trained animals, used sleight of hand, or performed tricks that locals couldn't explain. Being too good at your job could get you labelled as unnatural. Others, particularly those with physical differences or exaggerated facial features, were feared or mocked more than they were celebrated. In some places such performers were welcomed as novelties. In others, they were chased off with stones. This unpredictability shaped the way jesters approached their work. Many developed personas, not unlike modern stage characters, using exaggerated voices, masks, or hand puppets to deflect attention away from their true selves. In a way, they hid in plain sight, telling uncomfortable truths through fiction. It was a delicate balance. Speak clearly enough to make people laugh, but subtly enough to avoid offence. Despite all this, some jesters formed bonds with certain towns. A kind innkeeper might let them sleep near the hearth on cold nights. A local blacksmith might offer a bowl of stew in exchange for a private show. Children often became their biggest fans, running barefoot behind them as they set up their little shows in village squares. In these moments, performance was not just survival, it was connection. Still, the road was relentless. Jesters had to carry their entire livelihoods with them. Instruments, costumes, puppets, maybe even a pet monkey or dog trained to dance. Their bodies paid the price. Sore joints, broken teeth, damaged knees from all the tumbling and dancing. There were no doctors waiting in the next town, no one to care for a jester who fell sick or got injured. Most healed slowly, if at all. And yet the laughter continued. During festival seasons, things could be brighter. Harvest time fairs, May Day, winter feasts, these were high points, where entire towns gathered for merriment. Here jesters could earn a decent haul. A good act might mean roasted meats, beer, a handful of copper coins, and even praise from the mayor. For a night, they could be stars. But come morning, the banners would be taken down. The stage dismantled, the town swept clean of festivity, and the jester once again would disappear down the road. They rarely stayed anywhere long enough to form roots. It wasn't just their profession, it was their identity. Constant movement, constant reinvention, constant performance. And maybe that's what made them different from other medieval figures. While lords clung to power and peasants clung to land, jesters clung to laughter. It was all they had, and it was more fragile than anyone realised. So next time you think of a jester, patched sleeves, jingling bells, dancing on a barrel, don't just think of jokes. Think of weathered boots. Think of empty stomachs. Think of crowds that didn't laugh, and nights spent under leaking skies. And then, think of courage. Because it takes courage to be funny when the world is cruel, to make music on the edge of hunger, to turn humiliation into art. The wandering jester was not just a fool, they were a mirror, reflecting joy, absurdity and truth, whether the audience was ready or not. In part 11 we'll explore the toll this life took, the illnesses, the injuries, the dark humour that bubbled up from constant suffering. But for now, let the road be quiet. Let your thoughts settle with the image of a lone figure, disappearing into the horizon, bag of tricks over one shoulder, and just a bit of laughter left in their pocket. Sleep well, friend. The fool walks on. Welcome back, sleepy traveller. Tonight, our story turns inward. We've laughed with the jesters, walked beside them through echoing courts and muddy roads, and watched them juggle not just balls or swords, but expectations, politics, and danger. But now, let's pause the performance and dim the lights a little more. Because behind every clever line, every silly mask, and every musical flourish was a body. A real, human body, often pushed to its absolute limit. Let's begin with a simple truth. Medieval life was hard for everyone, but for jesters, whose job demanded constant physical effort and no real safety net, it was especially brutal. Whether they were flipping through the air in a court hall or dancing in the dirt of a village square, jesters were athletes, acrobats, dancers, puppeteers, mimics, musicians, and unlike warriors, who wore armour, or monks, who had cloisters, jesters had no protection, no real resting place. Just worn-out shoes, sore muscles, and whatever shelter they could find between performances. In castles they often slept in cramped servant quarters or near kitchens, close to warmth, but far from comfort. In the wild or on the road they had it worse. Sleep was scarce, and waking up sore or sick was common. There were no chiropractors or warm baths waiting. A pulled muscle could mean days without income. A bad fall, possibly the end of their career, or their life. And let's not forget, these weren't just sedentary performers. The expectation was motion, continuous, energetic, and exaggerated. They danced, leaped, somersaulted, and mimicked everyone from the king to the cook. If they played instruments, and many did, it added even more physical demands. Lutes, drums, bagpipes. Not exactly ergonomic. Then there were the costumes. Colourful, sure, but practical. Not at all. Heavy bells sewn onto their hats or belts jangled with every move. Some outfits were stuffed, layered, or stitched from rough fabrics that scratched and chafed. In the summer, they overheated. In the winter, they froze. But the show had to go on. In fact, one of the most common physical complaints among jesters, especially those who perform for long stretches, was joint pain. Knees, hips, backs. It wasn't glamorous, and no one applauded when a jester quietly grimaced after a performance. There was no retirement plan. Most simply performed until they physically couldn't anymore. And then, what? Some tried to adapt. They created acts that required less jumping, more storytelling. They leaned into music, puppetry, satire. But this only worked if the audience, and the court, allowed it. If they didn't keep up with the times or couldn't impress, they were replaced, forgotten. Now, let's talk teeth. You may not think of dental health as a jester problem, but it was. Food for performers was rarely fresh. Often, jesters at court were given leftovers or scraps. On the road, they ate what they could scavenge or afford. Bread could be rock hard, water unclean. Many jesters developed cracked or missing teeth by their 30s, and in a profession where smiles were part of the job, That wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. Illness, too, was a constant threat. Castles and towns were full of disease. Rats, fleas, spoiled food, and poor sanitation made sickness almost inevitable. Colds turned into lung infections. Small injuries became infected, and for jesters, who had to project their voice, sing, shout, laugh, any kind of throat or chest problem was a serious setback. And if all that weren't enough, consider this. Jesters were sometimes sent to entertain the sick, even plague victims. It might sound like an exaggeration, but it happened. A noble family, desperate for distraction, would send their fool to the sick room. Whether out of cruelty or tradition, the jester would go, bells jingling, dancing a little jig in the face of death. The emotional toll of this, well, we'll get to that in part 11b, but for now, imagine the wear and tear, the constant performance layered on a fragile frame, the sprains that never healed properly, the hearing loss from too many shouting crowds, the fingers bruised from playing old warped instruments, the twisted ankles on cobblestones, the cuts from broken glass in the marketplace, and still they smiled. Because if the jester didn't smile, who would? In a world of war, famine, and fear, the jester's body became a tool, a way to create joy, even when their own limbs were screaming in protest. So tonight, as you rest your own body, hopefully in warmth and comfort, spare a quiet moment for those who didn't have the luxury. Those who danced in pain, juggled through headaches, and turned their very breath into a performance. Their work was invisible until it wasn't, and often, by the time anyone noticed the toll, it was already too late. In part 11b, we'll gently explore the emotional cost of living as a permanent performer, always on display, always one misstep from punishment or dismissal. Welcome back, dear listener. As you rest your head, we continue our quiet journey through the world of the medieval jester. Not in laughter this time, but in silence. Because tonight we gently pull back the final layer of the jester's costume, the emotional mask. We've spoken of the physical strain, the cold nights, the injuries and the fatigue. But there was something heavier than any jester's cap or jangling bells. It was the emotional weight of being a tool of joy in a world that often felt joyless. A mirror for laughter, even when the soul behind the face paint was breaking. Let's begin with the most obvious truth. Jesters were not allowed to have bad days. Imagine that. No matter how sick, how sad, how frightened or exhausted, they had to smile, had to dance, had to perform. Their job was to lift others up, even if they were falling apart inside. And in a medieval court, emotions weren't something you shared openly. Nobles didn't ask how you were feeling. They expected amusement, distraction, or obedience. Jesters weren't seen as people, not really. They were seen as instruments, living entertainment machines. If a king was angry, the jester had to joke. If a queen wept, the jester had to sing. If war broke out, and fear gripped the entire court, the jester had to mock the enemy, poke fun at death, turn sorrow into satire. There was no room for vulnerability. And yet, jesters were deeply aware of human emotions. Their survival depended on it. They had to read a room with precision, detect the tiniest shift in mood, navigate tension with grace and subtlety. If they misread a noble's anger as amusement, they could be punished. If they pressed a joke too far in a grieving hall, they might be beaten, or worse. So imagine living in that constant emotional tightrope, always calculating, always masking your own feelings behind the safest version of yourself. Never able to say, I'm tired, or I'm hurting, or I'm scared. And it went deeper. Some jesters, especially those who had been forced into the role, through coercion, disability, or captivity, carried an emotional burden from the very beginning. They didn't choose this life. They were turned into a performance for the amusement of those who held power over them. Imagine being laughed at not because you were funny, but because your body was different, or because your past was tragic. That kind of performance? It's not art. It's survival under pressure. Even those who chose the role, who found joy in performance, weren't spared. Their identity became tangled in the character they played. Over time, many jesters reported feeling invisible when they weren't performing. People didn't want to see the real person behind the costume. They wanted the persona, the silliness, the escape. Some jesters found a strange freedom in this, permission to say what others could not, under the mask of humour. They could mock kings, speak uncomfortable truths, or criticise war or taxes, all by wrapping it in a joke. But even that freedom came with a price. One wrong word, one joke too raw, and the mask wasn't a shield anymore. It was a target. Records of jesters disappearing from court histories are not uncommon. Sometimes their contracts ended, sometimes they left, but often it's believed they were simply removed. Whether by dismissal, punishment, or death, no one knows for sure. But the silence in the record speaks volumes. Then there's the loneliness. Jesters often existed in a strange liminal space, not quite servants, not quite nobles, not truly of the court, but always present within it. They were excluded from real friendships, from family life, from companionship. They were always on, even when everyone else had the luxury to be off. That isolation, over time, became its own kind of prison. And when age crept in, and it always did, jesters found themselves truly alone, without savings, without family, and often too worn down to keep performing. Those who didn't die young often lived their last years in obscurity, dependent on the charity of the very courts they once entertained. Still, not all was bleak. Some jesters formed deep, even surprising connections. A few kings valued their jesters not just as performers, but as trusted voices, advisors cloaked in humour. There are stories of jesters who were buried with honours, or who lived out their final days in relative peace, rewarded for a lifetime of service, but those were the exceptions, not the rule. So as you drift tonight, think of the laughter you've known, the joy someone else gave you in a hard moment. Then imagine being the one who always gives, but never gets to pause, never gets to be seen without the mask. The medieval jester was more than a clown. They were a human being, fragile, resilient, clever, and quietly burdened. And in the hush of night, when the court was finally asleep and the fires low, perhaps the jester lay awake, wondering if tomorrow they'd still be laughing. Welcome back one last time, gentle listener. You've journeyed with us through firelit halls and windswept roads, through laughter and loss, through painted smiles and aching bones, and now, with our story nearing its close, it's time to follow the jester to their final stage, the quiet ending. There was no grand curtain call for most jesters. No final applause, no retirement celebration, no feathered hat hung reverently on the wall. In fact, for many, their departure from history was as quiet and invisible as their lives had often been. By the late Middle Ages, around the 15th and 16th centuries, the jester's role had already begun to fade. The rise of professional theatre troupes, printed books, and new forms of entertainment, like troubadours and minstrels, started to edge the traditional fool out of the spotlight. Royal courts became more formal, more politically charged, and less inclined toward the unpredictable chaos of jesters. But even before this slow disappearance, most jesters didn't last long in their roles. Their average tenure was about 4 years. Some, of course, lasted longer, those with sharper wits, better timing, or kinder lords. But many burned out quickly. The demands were simply too great. And what happened to them? That's the difficult part. Records rarely say. The very nature of a jester's role made them simultaneously visible and disposable. Their names were sometimes recorded in royal accounts: fool to the king, keeper of mirth, he who sings at supper. But when they were dismissed or died, or simply left, the ink stopped. We don't know where most of them went. Some may have become beggars, wandering performers, or tried to shift into other trades. A few lucky ones were given small pensions or allowed to live out their days quietly on noble land. Others may have simply vanished into the crowd, ordinary people once more, without fanfare or flair, but their legacy lived on, not in fame or fortune, not even always in memory, but in echoes. You see, the jester wasn't just a clown. They were one of the earliest social commentators. They used humour to speak truth to power, to make people think while they laughed, to shine a mirror on a world that was often cold, violent, and confusing. They were an early version of the modern comedian, the satirist, the late-night host. They poked holes in pride, They revealed the absurdities of war, of monarchy, of greed. They also quite simply made people smile. In a time when life was short, uncertain, and often brutal, that smile meant something. That moment of shared laughter could lift the weight of an entire village, or soften the heart of a grieving king. That single clever joke delivered just right could prevent a war, or start one. The stakes were real, the laughter hard-earned. And so, even though the jesters of old eventually disappeared, their spirit carried forward. You see them in Shakespeare's fools, those oddball characters who seem silly, but always speak the deepest truths. You hear them in court jesters of fantasy, in the mischievous but wise archetypes of stories and legends. You feel them in the performers today who bring laughter to hospital rooms, or use comedy to critique injustice, or simply make someone's bad day a little better. And tonight you've honoured them. You've taken the time to listen, not just to their jokes, but to their journey. You've seen the human behind the painted face. You've walked beside them through damp cellars and echoing great halls, through laughter and fear, through silence and song. So let this final moment be a quiet tribute, not to the myth of the fool, but to the reality. To the jester who performed until their knees gave out. To the jester who made a grieving queen smile for the first time in weeks. To the jester who dared to tell the truth with a wink and a rhyme. To the jester who danced on cold stone floors and made tired peasants forget their hunger for just a moment. To the jester whose name we don't remember, but whose laughter once filled the air. Now, as the fire burns low and your eyelids grow heavy, let this story be your lullaby. Let it remind you that behind every moment of joy in history someone worked, often in silence, often unseen, to bring it into the world. The jester's final bow was not one of thunderous applause. It was a soft exit, a quiet breath, a memory, maybe, left behind in the echo of laughter. Good night, traveller, and thank you for listening, for caring, for keeping the forgotten a little less forgotten. Sleep well.